This week we're looking at chapters 22 to 29, so quite a short bit of her text, but I hope you've enjoyed reading it. I have to say that I've been working quite a lot with these chapters recently because they're the sort of the basis for my next book. So, and I've actually managed to finish my next book, which is a little bit of a miracle. And that's all to do with All Shall Be Well and the Visions of Salvation with Julian of Norwich. So, and that is mainly focused on these areas. So I hope you really enjoy them and have a really good conversation. So this forms a kind of group of showings, which, as you've probably noticed, are very different from what you were looking at last week, which were very much concerned with the passion of Jesus Christ and his suffering as a human being. So we had lots of blood and we had him dying and drying out, and it's all quite visceral in the way that she describes her visions. But these, suddenly we seem to have changed tack quite considerably. So I'm going to just go through each one of them. I can give you an understanding and a bit of a background to what might be going on, so that when you go into your discussions and look at some of the questions, you have a sort of a sense of what this part of her showings are like and why they actually form a whole, and why are they so very different from the first 8. So I think one of the main differences here with showing number 9, which we start with, is that Jesus starts speaking. So Jesus's locutions, as we describe them. And you will notice that these start to increase as we go through. So in this showing, it's just a few words, it's just a sentence or so, but then it grows and grows. And then we have with Revelation 13, we have a whole dialogue, and it really does sort of take off. So that in Revelation 12, it's pretty much all what Jesus says. And then, as I say, 13, she enters into very much a dialogue with him about the whole issue of all shall be well. Now, in the translation that we've got, Jesus says to Julian, are you well pleased with what I've done? Which is very nice. Isn't that lovely? Are you pleased with what I've done on the cross? But what's really interesting is that if you go back to the Middle English, that's not the words he actually says. He says, are you well paid? That's the word that you find in the Middle English. Well paid, P-A-Y-E-D. Now, you can translate that a number of ways. And obviously, Barry Windiot has translated it as, are you pleased? But you can also translate it in the way of, are you satisfied? Now, if you think of it in terms of satisfaction, immediately you've got a heavily loaded theological term coming in and referring to the satisfaction theory of atonement. Now, just to remind you, if you're a little bit rusty on your atonement theories, this was one that was put forward by Anselm, and it replaced the ransom theory. And the ransom theory is very much the rights of the devil over sinful humanity, and Christ comes and ousts the devil and pays the ransom in a kind of lordship manner. So Anselm kind of gets rid of that, and he replaces it with an atonement theory that very much focuses on the justice of God. So basically, sin is seen as an affront to the justice of God, okay? And that the only person who can actually restore the justice, pay to God the dues that he is owed, is actually someone who is without sin, a God man. And so Jesus is seen as the God man, so his divinity and his humanity, the only person who can then take on the consequences of sin and restore justice, and so satisfy God for the restoration of that justice. Now, that's really interesting if you think about it and understand it in this way, because I think it gives us a bit of an insight into something quite remarkable that Julian is doing. I think she is using that word in terms with that theological understanding behind it. Because instead, what Jesus is saying is, are you well satisfied? Are you satisfied by what I've done? But he's not saying that to the Father, which is what you'd expect in the atonement theory. Is he saying it to Julian, the affronted human person for whom sin has actually destroyed their relationship with God? It's the humanity that has been destroyed, and marred and distorted. And so he's saying to her, are you well satisfied? Which is why Julian reacts, oh gosh, yes, of course I am, in this kind of, why are you even asking me, in this beautiful sort of sense of, and it reflects once again that lovely notion of the homeliness, the humility of Christ, who comes to humanity, who comes to Julian and says, well, are you pleased with what I've done, in a kind of really touching, sort of beautiful way? And I think that's really powerful. And to me, that seems to be what Julian is trying to express, that the loving nature of God says to us, well, are you satisfied with what I've done? So that really is a kind of a turning point, I think, between our revelations. So the first 8 that we looked on is all about the cross and all about the suffering of Christ. Well, most of them are. There are 1 or 2 that are slightly different, but most of them are on this. And that seems to be the pivotal moment when her revelations change from being focused on the suffering, the passion, the satisfaction, the atonement, all that, and they move into this realm of visions of salvation. So mainly, what is the point of the cross? What difference does it make for us as humanity? Because it might be very nice, Jesus dies, but what difference does it make? And that seems to me what the rest of the showings go on to talk about in theological terms, which is what we're going to look at tonight, but also the later ones, which are very much in pastoral terms. So how we actually are the nation in which God wraps his love around us. What does that tangibly feel like, and what does it mean for us in our lives today? So no wonder we have this change in tone from very sorrowing, very kind of lamenting, sort of, this is terrible, of the first ones which are focused on the passion, to this sense of utter joy. And you get that where Julian is shown the 3 heavens. And of course, it's very obvious that the 3 heavens that she's talking about are the Trinity. And I've said this before, that actually Julian has a really robust theology of the Trinity. It's not something that's tagged on at the end. Actually, undergirding all her theology is this notion of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, the creative Father, the loving Son, and then the Holy Spirit, which is the keeper and the person who actually is with us through our lives, helping us when we fall and when we rise. So these are the three heavens of which she speaks. So she's really setting the tone, and this showing is really setting the tone for the ones that are going to come after. The next three are very interesting. The first two, so that's Revelation 10 and 11, are really they kind of mix up, so you can read them in different ways. So they move and they change, and you can interpret them in different forms. So you can interpret them as showings which are still rooted in the Passion, but also as rooted in the resurrection narratives. So they have this kind of dual nature, the kind of the light and the dark that sort of plays with each other in the next two particularly. So if we look at the 10th showing, so Jesus is looking down at his side, looking down his side. That's what she describes the bodily showing as. But of course, if you look at any medieval depiction of the Passion, you will see that absolutely Julian, Jesus's head is on one side, and he's sort of looking downwards. So it's very much keys into the iconography of the crucifixion. Christ is looking down to the side where he has the great wound in his side that has been caused by the spear that's been speared by the Roman. But then she goes on and talks about the touching of the wound, and that immediately resonates with the story of Thomas, who wasn't there at the first sort of revealing of the resurrected Christ, and says, well, I won't believe unless I can touch it and put my hand in the wound. And so we have that biblical story resonating in our minds. But what Julian does, and what her vision does, is it follows very much a kind of iconography of the time, a kind of interpretation and understanding of the wounds of Christ at the time. They'd become really big, the notion of the wounds. They'd become a really big focus of devotion towards the end of the 14th century, so that you had particular liturgical events and particular feasts that were put into the liturgical calendar that celebrated the wounds of Christ. So we know that this was a big thing at the end of the 14th century. And one of the reasons it was so big was because in tradition, it was from the wounds of Christ that we had the institution of the sacraments of baptism and the Eucharist. There are some wonderful pictures of crucifixions where you have a very beautiful ecclesia as a lady, and she's holding a chalice underneath Jesus's wound and sort of catching the drops that fall. So it's a very immediate connection with what people were doing in church, with the person of Jesus on the cross, and that his wounds and the blood is actually what they are receiving when they go to church in the sacrament of the Eucharist. So it's a kind of very, as I say again, a very visceral understanding of the Eucharist, but it connects in a kind of subliminal way for people, so that what Christ did on the cross is not something in the past, it's something in the present that they're absolutely receiving. Also, at this time, you find that some devotional writers, it is also found in the Ancre Novisa of the 13th century, but also some devotional writers, again, are very concerned about sin and being clean of sin. And they describe the notion of going into the wound of Jesus. And they describe it in terms of you grope into into the flesh of Christ. And there you will find a safe space where where the saved are nurtured and held, and you're safe. You're safe from sin. And this is really important for the late medieval period, where, of course, your salvation depended on whether you were safe and whether you didn't sin. And of course, you had all the mechanisms of the church, like, baptism, the Eucharist, confession, penance, all those, which were, again, to keep you safe. So this notion that when you are partaking of those sacraments is that you're groping within the wound of Christ, and they're being surrounded. And of course, Julian describes in her showing that she goes into the wound, and there she sees the cloven heart of Christ, the broken heart, which is the center of where the blood and the water of Christ flows. So it's not just something in his hand, she wants to go right back to the source. So where does this blood and water come from? Where is this sacrament really located? And it's located right deep in the heart of Christ. So you have this imagery in the Ancre Novisa, which is completely comparable. You can literally put Julian's showing next to the Ancre Novisa and see using the similar language. So we have very much in this Revelation 10, showing 10, a vision of how we're saved through the cross and how we're saved through the reception of the sacraments. Then we move into showing 11. And once again, we have this kind of strange atmosphere where we can interpret it one way or another. It's kind of the ground is shifting under us. And it's a very clever way of writing, because she gives us the language, but the interpretation is very edgy. It keeps us on our toes. We can't just say, oh, well, it means that. We can't pin it down. She keeps us right on the edge, which must have been what her revelation, how she experienced her showing, that it was strange. It was, it was difficult to describe. It was difficult to understand. So in this one, we have, it resonates with Mary at the foot of the cross. Now, the role of Mary and Julian is very, very important. She keeps popping up at key moments. And of course, Mary is not only the person as mother who loves Jesus the most, of all Christ's lovers, she's the one who has most love for him because she's his mother. But also, she's the one, therefore, who suffers most, because at the foot of the cross, because she loves him so much. And therefore, for Julian, she becomes the perfect icon of a contemplative. If you want to know what the contemplative life is like, then Mary is your icon. Mary is the one who goes before and shows what the love of Christ is really like. But what's really beautiful about this is, and I think it's really lovely, how Julian expresses it, is that she's seen not only as a mirror to the glory and joy that we will be given in heaven, but her truth, her wisdom, her love is, as she says, through which I may learn to know myself. And also, it is through her that we come to realize how much Christ loves us. So in a way, Mary stands in that place, but she stands in the place where we stand. And as Christ looks lovingly at Mary, the Mother Mary, she stands in the place where we inhabit as well. So it's not like Jesus just has love for his Mother Mary, but actually she shows us how Christ loves, how God loves us. We move then to showing 12, and this is perhaps the most ecstatic of all the showings that we are given, and the language, Jesus's locutions take over this whole showing itself, and he kind of pummels us with the different descriptions. I am, I it am, I it am, I it am, and I can boom, 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 until actually the language just sort of breaks down, the meaning breaks down, and Julian's sort of taken to right to the edge of the apophatic, where language is no longer able to express the glory and the being of God. And so she just ends up saying, I really don't know. I don't know, and in a way she's taken us too by heaping up. I mean, she could, if she wanted to, describe this in a very different way, but she doesn't. She leaves it, boom, I it am, I it am, I it am. And she leaves us too in that place where actually we get to the end of it and go, what's going on? And that's the place. For those of you who were in the book group for the Cloud of Unknowing, that's the place of the Cloud of Unknowing. So Julian doesn't just describe it, she takes us to that place of unknowing, when language just doesn't actually manage to capture anymore the glory and the person of our Saviour Jesus Christ. And then we come down with a bit of a bump on the 13th showing, because Julian just kind of goes, okay, yeah, that's great. This is all wonderful. And she puts in this thing, well, I'm just wondering about just wondering, why then? This is all fantastic. Why then did God allow sin? Because, if it wasn't for that, all would be well. And it's Julian who says those words, all will be well. Why is all not well? And of course, those are the words that Jesus then picks up and catapults us into this whole section that's all about all shall be well. All shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. But I'm going to stop there, because in a sense, that's for next week. And I think next week we will pick up a little bit about sinners behaviorally, and sinners, we'll pick that up as we take it into the all shall be well, which is the great kind of dialogue, the dialectic between Julian and Christ, as she thrashes through that question. And so that will be next week. But it's really I'm looking forward to next week. So I will stop there